My family has never once sat around a table and wondered if the money would run out. Not once. Not during the oil embargo. Not during the crash of 2008. Not when inflation gutted currencies across 3 continents simultaneously. Not when American retirees were liquidating accounts to cover grocery bills. Not when the headlines said the financial system itself was on the edge of collapse. Not once. I want you to understand what that means. Because most of you watching this have had that conversation. Some of you are having it right now. You did everything they told you to do. You showed up to work for 30 years. You saved what you could. You contributed to the account every month without missing. You trusted the advisor sitting across the desk who spoke with confidence about diversification and managed risk. You waited. And after all of that, you are still afraid. Not a small fear. The kind that sits with you at 3 in the morning when the calculations do not work out the way you need them to. The kind that makes you wonder whether the number in the account will last as long as you do. 64% of Americans over 60 are more afraid of running out of money than they are of dying. I have read that statistic many times. And every time I read it, the same thought follows. That fear is not your fault. It was engineered. If this is the first time you are hearing that, stay with me. Because what I am about to show you is not a theory. It is not a financial product. It is a system. One my family and families like mine have used for over 100 years. And it works precisely because it was never meant for you. If you find this channel useful, make sure to subscribe and share it with someone who should know. I have spent 40 years watching 2 financial worlds operate simultaneously. One world I was born into. The other I watched from the outside. Through decisions made in rooms most people never enter. Through structures built quietly while something louder was being announced publicly. Through conversations between institutions that never appeared in any press release. In my world, wealth does not erode. It transfers. It compounds across generations not because we are smarter. Not because we worked harder. But because we hold different things. In your world, wealth is stored in numbers on screens. In accounts managed by institutions that charge fees whether you gain or lose. In a currency that has been quietly and systematically losing its purchasing power for over 50 years. I watched that happen. I watched the specific decision that made it happen. And I watched the people who made that decision ensure that while ordinary Americans held the currency that was losing value, other people quietly held the things that were gaining it. In 1971, Richard Nixon stood in front of a camera and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. One announcement. One decision. The dollar was severed from the only thing that kept it honest. Before that day, every dollar in circulation was backed by a fixed amount of physical gold. That backing was the constraint. It was the reason a government could not simply print money without consequence. The moment that constraint was removed, the consequence arrived slowly enough that most people did not notice it happening. Since 1971, the dollar has lost 85% of its purchasing power. What cost $1 then costs nearly $7 today. Your salary went up. Your savings stayed denominated in the same currency that was shrinking. The gap between those two things is where 40 years of American retirement security quietly disappeared. This was not an accident. This was the predictable result of removing the anchor. The people who designed that system knew exactly what it would do. And they built their own holdings accordingly. That is the gap between my world and yours. That is what this video is about. I am going to show you 3 assets today. Not theories. Not abstractions. Not financial instruments that require a licensed advisor to explain. 3 specific categories of physical wealth that dynasties like mine have held for over a century. 3 categories that have preserved and grown value through every crisis, every currency collapse, and every institutional failure of the last 100 years. I am also going to show you something else. I am going to show you why the American financial system spent 50 years ensuring you never seriously considered any of them. Not because the information was classified. Not because these assets were unavailable. Because the system was not built to make you financially independent. It was built to keep you in managed accounts generating ongoing fees for institutions that profit whether your balance grows or shrinks. There is a significant difference between a system designed for your financial independence and a system designed around its own revenue. By the time this video ends, you will understand that difference completely. And you will understand why the three assets I am about to describe were the ones that difference was built to keep you away from. Let me tell you what happens when a child is born into a Saudi family. Gold is given. Not a savings bond. Not a contribution to a managed fund. Not a paper certificate promising future value. Physical gold. It is placed in the family's possession on the day that child arrives. And it does not stop there. At every significant moment across that child's life, every wedding, every milestone, every transition from one stage of life to the next, physical gold changes hands within the family. By the time that child reaches adulthood, they have accumulated physical metal through years of family tradition that most people looking from the outside would simply call culture. It is not just culture. It is a system disguised as culture. And it works. Gold demand in Saudi Arabia jumped 35% year-over-year in the first quarter of 2025. During the same period, global gold demand dropped 21%. While the rest of the world was moving away from gold, Saudi families were accelerating toward it. That pattern is not new. It has repeated through every period of economic uncertainty for over a generation. When the signals say instability is coming, Saudi families do not move into cash. They move into metal. Now I want you to look at what American retirees were told to do during those same periods of uncertainty. Stay the course. Trust the market. Keep contributing to the managed account. In 1971, the same year Nixon removed the dollar's gold backing, 1 ounce of gold was priced at $35. Today that same ounce is worth more than $2,000. The dollar you held in 1971 is worth 15 cents of what it bought then. The gold you could have held instead has multiplied more than 50 times in dollar terms. Your advisor knew this history. He did not present it to you as an option. I want to explain exactly why, because the reason is simpler than most people expect. The brokerage system is built on managed accounts. Managed accounts generate advisory fees. Annual percentages charged on the balance regardless of performance. Physical gold sitting in your possession generates nothing for the institution. There is no account to manage. There is no annual fee to collect. There is no reason for a system built around advisory revenue to recommend an asset that removes you from that system entirely. This is not a conspiracy. It is a business model. The advisor sitting across the desk from you was not lying. He was operating exactly as his incentive structure trained him to operate. You were not financially illiterate. You were financially misdirected by a system pointing you toward the assets that served its interests. The difference between those two things matters enormously. Before the first barrel of oil was ever extracted from Saudi soil, my family held land. Land granted across generations. Land that required no institution to maintain its value. Land that could not be printed. Land that could not be inflated by a central bank decision made on a Tuesday morning. Land that existed completely independently of whatever the dollar was doing. That is the foundation my family was built on. Not the oil. The land came first. The oil was discovered inside land that was already held. That sequence matters more than most people realize. Now I want you to examine honestly what the average American retiree actually holds at the end of a working life. A managed retirement account invested in paper assets. A home with a mortgage still attached to it. A social security entitlement promised by a government. I want you to look at what those three things have in common. Every single one of them is a promise from an institution. The retirement account is a promise from the market to deliver future value from assets held in your name by a brokerage. The mortgage home is a promise you are still making to a bank, one that holds a legal claim on the property until the final payment clears. The Social Security entitlement is a promise from a federal government that is currently carrying $36 trillion in debt with no credible plan to reduce it. 3 assets. 3 institutional promises. None of them exist in the physical world independent of the institutions behind them. Now contrast that with land owned outright. No mortgage. No counterparty. No institution whose solvency determines whether the asset retains its value. A man who owns 10 acres of land outright owns something real regardless of what the Federal Reserve decides this quarter. Regardless of whether his brokerage remains solvent. Regardless of whether a government 50 years from now honors an obligation made by a government today. The land simply exists. I knew a man who had worked his entire career in manufacturing in the Midwest, who retired in 1981 with what he believed was a solid financial foundation. A pension. A savings account. A house with 5 years left on the mortgage. By 1986 the pension fund had reduced payments twice. The savings account had not kept pace with inflation. The house was his only asset that had held its value completely. The one thing he owned outright was the one thing that required no promise from anyone. Wealth stored in promises is only as strong as the institution making the promise. Wealth stored in land requires no promises at all. That is not a philosophical statement. It is a structural one. This is the asset most Americans have never seriously been introduced to. And it requires the most careful explanation. So I want you to stay with this section completely. Since 1973, energy prices have increased over 1,000%. Every time you fill a gas tank, that money goes somewhere. Every time you pay a utility bill, that money goes somewhere. Every time an airline ticket rises because fuel costs rose overnight, that money goes somewhere. It goes to the owners of the assets that produce the energy. For 50 years, ordinary Americans have been reliably on the paying side of that transaction. Every single month. Without interruption. Through recessions, through market crashes, through every economic disruption of the last half-century. The energy bill kept arriving. And the wealth embedded in that bill kept transferring, from consumers to asset owners. Dynasties like mine have been on the receiving side of that transfer for generations. That is not fate. That is not luck. That is asset ownership. Now here is what the American financial system chose not to make obvious to ordinary investors. Income-producing energy assets have been available through American public markets for decades. Royalty trusts. Pipeline royalties. Master limited partnerships. These are instruments that pay distributions directly from energy production. Not from market speculation. Not from a fund manager's quarterly decisions. From actual physical production of actual physical energy. When oil moves through a pipeline, the owners of the pipeline royalty receive income. When a well produces, the owners of the royalty trust receive a distribution. The broader market can be falling. Interest rates can be rising. A portfolio manager can be completely wrong about the quarter. None of that changes whether the energy was produced. None of that changes whether the distribution was paid. The production happened. The income followed. That is a fundamentally different relationship with wealth than holding a managed account that rises and falls with market sentiment. Now ask yourself the same question I asked about gold. Why did your advisor never seriously present this as an option? The answer is identical. Royalty income flows directly to the asset owner. It does not flow through a managed account. It does not generate the ongoing advisory fees that the brokerage system depends on. An advisor who helps you acquire energy royalty positions has created a client who no longer needs active management. An advisor who keeps you in a managed account has created a revenue relationship that continues indefinitely. The system was not designed against you personally. It was designed around incentives that were never aligned with yours. Recognizing that is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a different set of decisions. Gold, land, energy. 3 categories. One principle connecting all of them. None are promises. All exist in the physical world independent of any institution's decision or solvency. All have held and grown value through every significant crisis of the last 100 years. Through 2 world wars. Through the complete collapse of multiple national currencies. Through the stagflation of the 1970s that gutted American purchasing power across an entire decade. Through 2008 when the institutions holding ordinary Americans' paper wealth revealed exactly how fragile that paper was. Through every moment when the system showed its actual structure beneath the surface it presented publicly. The American retirement system was built on a different foundation entirely. Paper assets. Managed accounts. Currency-denominated promises from institutions operating with their own set of incentives. That foundation has produced exactly the outcome your generation is now experiencing. A retirement built on assets that can be inflated, diluted, and managed by parties whose interests are not identical to yours. A fear that cannot be reasoned away because it is grounded in something structurally real. You followed the instructions correctly. The instructions were written for someone else's benefit. I have watched American families do everything right for 40 years. Save diligently. Contribute without fail. Trust the system completely. And arrive at the end of their working lives holding a number on a screen that loses ground to inflation a little faster every single year. I am not telling you this to produce anger. Anger is a response to surprise. I am not surprised. I watched the system be constructed. I am telling you this because the assets that protect against exactly what you are experiencing have existed the entire time. They were available. They were simply never presented to you as serious options by a system that had no financial interest in presenting them. In the videos that follow, I will go deeper into each of these three categories. How physical gold is acquired and held completely outside the managed account system. How land ownership functions as a generational wealth mechanism even for families without dynastic resources behind them. How energy royalty instruments have performed historically and what the actual income record looks like across multiple economic cycles. This is not about recovering lost time overnight. It is about understanding what wealth actually is at its foundation. Physical. Unencumbered. Requiring no institution's promise to hold its value. And making sure that what took a lifetime to build does not quietly disappear before you are finished needing it. I will see you in the next one. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss our videos.